Has social media resulted in greater honest expression or more curation and construction of the reality of one's experience and opinions?
I think for the most part it's, less honest expression in some ways, but and it's more sort of constructing a reality thing. But a lot of people say that as a negative, you know what I mean? Mm. Like this is something that's very deceptive about Facebook. And perhaps among younger people that might be more of a truth, you know what I mean? Like where it's, the filters and the poses and the sort of doing the most, sort of beautifying angles of this and that kind of stuff.
More what
false construction.
I think social media has introduced the worst of high school to the entire universe. I think that the opportunities for discussion are there, and that more often than not, people's worst selves get expressed on social media because of the feeling of anonymity. Like somehow it's okay if I hurt your feelings because I'm not looking you in the face, I'm not seeing your pain, I can just spew whatever's out. I see a lot of younger people leaving social media platforms because of that. And I also have a growing number of friends who have learned the fine art of deleting everything you've written and deciding to just take a pass or to write something reasonable.
I think the idea that social media creates either people who are curating themselves or people who are expressing themselves in new ways probably ignores the fact that it is completely different for each person. And I feel like not that there isn't an overall trend, but I do think that to some people they use social media as a way to gain popularity or create an image. And I think that anytime that one does that, they end up curating themselves. I think for other sectors of people, especially kind of liberal individuals, social media is a way to express oneself in a way that's unique to them and in a way that is very specific and opinionated. And I think that for those people, social media obviously is totally great to get their opinions out and to try to communicate something versus someone who probably let's say uses Facebook simply to talk about their last vacation. I think that those people are probably putting views that are far more contrived.
What, if any, is your experience of engaging in political discussions on social media?
Not very good, very pseudo-intellectual. I think that I end up talking with people for the sake of disagreeing with them. I like disagreeing with people. I like trying to prove people wrong, and in some ways I enjoy doing that publicly. So social media, at least in the past, has been a place for me to actively have an argument with somebody. So yeah.
Yeah, I do that too.
I have since stopped though. I don't do that. I think I've gotten a lot better. That's just in the past, but
yeah.
Feel free to put that in. I don't care.
Yeah, no, it's tempting to play devil's advocate all the time.
And do you want me to, so should I, since you like squatting down, I feel like, okay.
I feel like on social media, people are always going to be fake, informally, because no one's ever gonna want to say, unfortunately, in this age, especially how social media is now, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, people are only going to share what makes them feel better, not the reality. So I don't think social media is making anyone honest. Maybe there are some exceptions, but the majority, I feel like they just share what they want to share. No one's going to share, like, if they're struggling,
Right.
or the bad in their life. They're only going to share the good in their life.
Okay, so most of my friends post their emotions on Snapchat, how they're feeling, what they're going through. So they're just expressing all of their feelings onto one social media or on multiple platforms, just to get other people's attention, just to see how other people would react to them feeling this sort of way. So it's kind of, just for their own satisfaction, knowing that people are there for them or people aren't there for them.
In Moral Believing Animals, Christian Smith writes, "For all of our science, rationality, and technology, we moderns are no less the makers, tellers, and believers of narrative construals of existence, history, and purpose than were our forebears at any time in human history. But more than that, we not only continue to be animals who make stories, but also animals who are made by our stories. We tell and retell narratives that themselves come fundamentally to constitute and direct our lives." Humans have a tendency to want to define themselves and to order their experiences and characteristics into a comprehensible story. We form these stories from paradigms, what Christian Smith would call meta-narratives, including the stories of our culture, our generation, and groups we feel we are a part of. Social media, which focuses on the retelling of events and the representation of the self, emphasizes this. Notably, Facebook's policy, which doesn't allow people to have multiple accounts or discourages it, pushes forth the belief that a person is one consistent self and the pursuit of a consolidated notion of identity.
It is very confusing how people use it. Like, one thing I have to say, I always think kind of fascinating, a couple times I've seen, is people, this sort of public mourning that happens sometimes after people have someone who died, or someone close to, and I'll have friends who just keep posting things, and I find that a really strange space to be doing that in. Like, I'm like, why? You got, so obviously some of your Facebook friends are good friends, you know what I mean? But a lot of them are like sort of, these layers of acquaintances from work, from previous jobs, from friends of your mom, you know what I mean? I mean, this is huge, range of people, and to be kind of putting out this very personal grief process.
Yes, I believe it has. Partly because social media is taking the farthest ends, I think, of the arguments in regard to identity issues like sexuality, politics, race, religion, ethnicity, and pushing for people to identify in ways that in the past maybe we were free to just be people.
I'm reposting things that I can relate to. Like the memes and the short videos, like things that I can relate to, especially from, like, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Me Too. So I'm always reposting things about that because I can relate to that. So I guess social media helps in a way. Helps you identify or create who you are, but at the same time, I don't, when you're, it helps me understand who I am and, what community I can most relate to. But at the same time, I don't think people should rely on a person's page to think that's who they are.
Well, I think the rise of identity politics probably preceded the social media because it really came out of the 60s and 70s when progressive, or parties with progressive politics started shifting away from class-based politics, representing the interests of the industrial working class and that kind of thing, towards issues such as racism and gender relations and sexuality and so on. I think, and then there was, of course, Black Power in the 60s. And I think out of that came the idea of identity politics on the left. So that was before the social media. In terms of what people think of themselves in the social media, I think in some ways it's had a bad effect, because the way that you learn about yourself and who you are and so on traditionally is through contact with other people, communication with other people, confrontations with other people, loving other people, and so on and so forth. And a lot of social activity now takes place online, meaning you never actually have to meet anybody to communicate in some way. And that means that your sense of self and self-esteem and all that starts to depend much more on kind of indirect virtual contact with people, and people can become frantically worried if they don't get enough likes on a posting somewhere and that kind of thing, which I do not think is an improvement. I think it is much better for people to interact personally.
Alright, so a lot of people see a lot of things on social media, whether it's like the way someone looks or the way someone acts or just the way someone talks. So when people, like, if I see something on social media of like a girl with like a really nice body, I'll be like, oh, you know, like, damn, I wish my body was like that. So it kind of like deconstructs on how you feel about yourself and your self-image, and it kind of ruins your self-esteem by seeing all these things. So like if you see a person in like a relationship, you're like, oh man, I wish I was in a relationship, you know?
Often people will act or speak without thinking. Arendt labels this phenomena of not thinking a component of her concept concerning the banality of evil. People often describe social media as fostering mind-numbing activity and judge the activities and communication happening on the platform to be less thoughtful than in real life. This may be the result of anonymity or the way social media sites are designed to be addictive by providing easy distractions. When we communicate without thinking, Arendt claims we depend on cliches and standardized codes of expression. Social media websites are often designed to make interactions faster and easier and involve the use of abbreviations, acronyms, and emojis. This may facilitate normative statements as opposed to complex, detailed analyses of events and people. At the same time, in certain circumstances, it may encourage people to think more before they act and post something that will enter the public domain that is written out and not just said. What, if any, is your experience of engaging in political discussions on social media? Does social media cause people to communicate more thoughtfully or with more reactivity?
So yeah, like I said before, I like to subscribe to news that I wouldn't agree with.
Yeah.
But even on the news that I do agree with, if you look under the comments, there is like that group of people who are saying, negative things. Like, for example, I am Latinas and I do have undocumented relatives. And one particular news article was about this man who was undocumented and he killed or murdered his wife and his daughter. And then there were some people who were saying, oh, this is why we should, support Donald Trump and build that wall and stuff like that. Like, this is what happens. And I didn't really agree with the title because the way that they phrased the title of the article was undocumented man murdered, but it started with undocumented man, and it was like capitalized. All the words are capitalized, and I instead of reacting in a thoughtful way, I reacted in a negative way where my messages towards them didn't have any facts. It was just, it was subjective. It wasn't objective.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I would say, in terms of sort of engaging politically, I mean, I like hearing what people are doing. I mean, I'm interested in sort of that kind of engagement and seeing what other people's thoughts are on about it. And like, for example, in West Virginia, we had that big teacher strike that kind of led to a flood of teacher strikes kind of happening across the country. And a lot of that was fueled on Facebook and social media. And that was very interesting, and people were, FaceTime streaming stuff about what was going on and what was happening at that moment down in the Capitol in Charleston, and so that was really good. And I feel like generally in terms of discussions, but it's also, but like I said, because I think I've had a couple of negative experiences with that, for the most part, I've kind of learned to just realize that's not the space I want that.
Not very good, very pseudo-intellectual. I think that I end up like talking with people for the sake of disagreeing with them. I like disagreeing with people. I like trying to prove people wrong, and in some ways I enjoy doing that publicly. So social media, at least in the past, has been a place for me to actively have an argument with somebody. So
based on the way where it's usually like you pick your friends, that you're gonna just be in a little bubble of whatever your thoughts are, unless you have really interesting friends.
No, true.
I mean, I think there are social media platforms that are designed for things like that. Like there's forums. Like you can, if you, I guess, have the time, you can go deep into the web and find the climate change, one of the million, I'm sure, climate change forums, and you can battle it out if you want, or you can on CNN. I think you can even comment on articles and stuff like that. So I think there are good opportunities for it, but it usually just ends up in some form of I had sex with your mom kind of argument. So
A paper by Soon-Mang Hong called Political Polarization on Twitter outlines the result that politicians with extreme ideological positions tend to have more Twitter followers, and discusses evidence that social media websites do not result in greater openness or acceptance of differences, but rather form echo chambers for the niche-orientated aspects of social media. People friend and follow others they agree with, and this becomes their main source of information, which is relevant to the phenomena of fake or biased news prevalent in this age. This conflicts with and reveals flaws in Mark Zuckerberg's vision of a more open and accepting world on Facebook, and also demonstrates the consequences of the increased focus on narratives of the self. Paul Tillich's idea that if he affirms himself by affirming the collective in which he participates, he receives himself back from the collective, filled and fulfilled by it, could very well be a complicated, philosophized description of the act of posting to a Facebook group. By contributing another echo to the echo chamber, you are rewarded with affirmation from other members of the group, giving a sense of fulfillment not provided by your own actions or merit. You have told them what they want to hear, and thus they give you the status of being a member. This system of social reward seems, in my experience, to be based around how cleverly one can state the purpose of the group or defend the group from outside invaders, making these little Facebook pages like nation-states of their own. All of these participants are embittered and emboldened to the extreme because of 1, the physical screen protecting them from immediate physical danger, and 2, the safety of the collectivist mentality that Tillich outlines.
I would say, generally, I think it does isolate you within your framework. Not necessarily, because I do think it sort of depends how you use the space to a certain degree. Like for me, I have very low tolerance for reading things that I find offensive. So I quickly block or unfriend people that I find politically disagreeable with myself, just because it's kind of not the space I go to for that. You know what I mean? Like if I'm going to read that, I'll read an opinion in the New York Times or something like that. I'll read something that I feel like comes from a little bit more of a legitimate stance.
Absolutely not. I think I think that social media is the biggest circle jerk on. Am I allowed to curse in this?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
I think that social media tends to invite a group of people to sort of follow their same sect of opinions and to find spheres in which they agree with people, and it also tends to lead to, I think, confirmation bias. As someone who has been on social media and tends to read only, for example, like left-leaning articles on social media, I'm not going to subject myself to opinions that I disagree with in general, which I think is probably a flaw, and I think everyone does that. They tend to, on social media specifically, since it's so easy to siphon out who you're talking to, you can just decide who you're talking to, so you end up talking to and interacting with people who agree with you, and I think that people are not, exposing themselves to opposing views.
In my personal experience, I read. I'm mostly on Facebook. I know that's not the great source to get my news from, but because I'm always on Facebook, I subscribe to different news articles, and for some reason I'm subscribed to the news articles that I know I won't agree to, but I like to also see what they say about things. Because I am Latina, I mostly I want to see what they say about undocumented people. Yeah.
Well, in theory, of course, the social media expose you to far more diverse opinions and views and things than would normally have been the case, because almost all the available knowledge, whether it's visual or in words, is available. But in practice, I'm not quite sure people avail themselves of those possibilities to the best advantage, and I think people do tend, and of course this is also driven by commercial interests and algorithms and so on, that people are pushed more and more into bubbles of like-minded people, of interests that algorithms establish that you have anyway.
I don't think it has an impact on people. I think people who want to learn what is available to learn will learn it, and those who have decided that they already know everything, that's just where they are at. I think it highlights where you're at as a human being, and I have friends that are across the real broad spectrum. I mean, far left, far right, anti-vaxxers and hyper-medical people. And so I try personally to read all of the different points of view, partly because I want to understand where people are coming from. But I realize that that is not the case with most of the people on social media.
I noticed that on my Facebook and my social media, all my friends are also Democrats, because I went to go to liberal arts school and I grew up in Los Angeles. So everyone posting something about politics or anything, well, it's all Democrat side. And I noticed that every single post, like I would go on my Facebook feed, there'd be like maybe 1 or 2 things about Hillary, and then the rest was still just Trump. It would be Trump, and then it would say, oh, he's an asshole for this, or he sucks because he said this, blah, blah, blah. And it would just be going pages and pages and pages of Trump. Even on my social media, which is supposed to be democratic, well, yeah, they're trash talking Trump, but on that quick scroll, you don't remember anything anyways, so you're sort of just remembering things that just stuck out to you. And I was thinking, like, okay, Trump's probably also on all of the Republican people's page, just saying he's great. So Trump is on literally everyone's social media page, and in that word, Trump is in every single person's mouth.
Right.
So he's gonna have a big influence. Like it's influence. It's not because he never. Every time he said something, that was it. Like that thing that he said had no. He didn't have any attachments, but he doesn't care really. So even if you're trash talking him because he's saying all these things, you're just still giving him attention and you're having him in your psyche. And I think that ended up actually making a lot of people probably end up voting for him because they went to the booth. Like if someone didn't follow it really, wasn't paying too much attention, they're sort of undecided, and they just heard the word Trump 50 times more than they heard the word Hillary when they see it on the ballot. They might just check it.
Irving Goffman, in the presentation of the self in everyday life, discusses performance and humans' desire to influence observers through their performance. Individuals who often have highly curated accounts and built personas on Instagrams and other sites are called influencers. With the rise of this performative behavior, as more and more individuals become or weave in and out of this role of public figures online, we see people being held more accountable for all of their activity and expressions, for better and for worse. We also see this line between the private and the public blurring, as people have become increasingly confused about what parts of themselves to reveal online and to which audience. Social media has made information about people's private lives much more accessible. People's expression to a wide audience has become more casual and everyday on social media in a way that might make people less cautious of what they are saying. One controversial post may be used to expose what people interpret to be a certain and permanent attribute of someone, and this can impact their ability to continue on with their career and lives. It often happens that this comes to represent the entire person, and the person may him or herself become a sort of symbol and, in less justified cases, a scapegoat for a political movement. In other words, it is a tool that often facilitates making an example out of someone. It may serve a purpose, although it also can result in censorship and a lack of forgiveness or lack of understanding towards the flaws and complexities of individuals.
Well, I'm very wary of that because I think one of the most negative aspects of the way that the social media operate is that it doesn't encourage debate, which would be a good thing. If you come across somebody who has views that you very much disagree with, the best way to deal with it would be to debate them and to come up with counter-arguments. The worst way is to say, this offends me, I'm uncomfortable, this person should disappear. And then a person is kind of can become the object of a sort of lynch mentality.
I got into Facebook because as a congregational leader, I found out that the children of some of my friends had very interesting lives their parents knew nothing about. And MySpace existed back then. So I first got involved in that essentially to spy on my friends' kids to try to be able to talk to them about things that they weren't talking to their parents about. And so then when the young people of our congregation all started getting into Facebook, I'd be the kind of policing of their future. Like I would send a private message going, really, when you apply for a teaching job in 3 years, do you really think that that picture of your butt hanging out somewhere is going to help your career?
Right.
You know, and trying to emphasize the fact that anything that gets put on Facebook or any social media, it's permanent.
Right.
Once that image is out there, anybody can do anything with it.
Yeah.
And to remind people that what you say will come back to haunt you.
Yeah.
I think like forgiveness is like the ultimate thing for me. It's like if you have the ability to forgive, it shows like your inner character and how strong you are within. Some people learn from their mistakes, other people don't. But you know, to like hurt somebody in a way where they can't get another job or you know live their life, it's like you completely ruin someone, and that's like out of character for me personally to do that to someone, which can affect their career and their family and their kids and all that. I could never like, you know, do something. So I don't think that's right. I think people everyone like the concept of human is like sinning and making mistakes. Every single person makes mistakes every single day.
Yeah.
In terms of canceling culture and SJWs, I abhor social justice warriors because those are the people that are only getting political because things not only just affect them directly, but they serve as an encumbrance toward them. Not something that's directly, you know, a threat or, you know, serving as an impediment on their lives, but just like, oh, it's making my life a little annoying. I don't really care about the environment. I care about my environment. And I think that's foolish. You know, if a comedian makes a joke or says something obscene, it's a joke. If you can't take a joke, you don't watch them. You don't purchase their tickets. You don't share their information. Don't listen. You know, turn off the TV, turn off the radio. But if somebody is embroiled in a scandal and you think their career should end, well, imagine if that happened to you. You would be saying, well, you don't know me. We don't know why, you know, such and such did this to these people. We just know that their behaviors are biologically quite weird. And we need to have a conversation about that. So it comes back to social media not really being a catalyst for effective conversations. It's just a catalyst for shouting, getting your point out, getting it out there. And dissemination is not cool. Everybody now, including the media, wants to be first. Everybody wants to have, you know, hot takes and quick takes, but we don't want to really have a deep dive onto things that'll establish a system or establish a progression that'll help us not only in society but biologically. If so-and-so is doing something and it causes a threat to their career, we should ask, you know this is bad, right? Not even from the laws and practices that we've established, but nobody really does that. And I'm being really vague because I don't want to bring attention or any specific examples, but if you're doing something that is a threat to your career, we need to ask, why would you do that? Were you taught to do that? Did you grow up in an environment where that was okay? Instead of ostracizing people for doing things we deem different and weird and morally bad, well, there are a lot of things that we all do that we're not aware of that we allow to happen, and we do. So we have to take a look in the mirror, you know.
Tool, you know what I mean, to organize people and to get them together and to have them learn about things, you know, very quickly. And I do feel like sometimes I get a little frustrated with my friends who are not on social media because they can be so out of the loop on certain things. Right, yeah. And I have one friend, I'm like her social media like reporter. Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, Jen, just so you know, all over Facebook, there's this meeting coming up and you should know about it.
Because of social media, like, you know, social media is going to bring the issue up.
Yeah.
But only a few out of those people who their attention was caught by it do something about it. The majority then forget about it.
What it can do is it can mobilize like-minded people to be active for a given cause. It allows people to communicate with one another very quickly in a way that wasn't possible before, to disseminate information and so on. And there are positive examples, not in dictatorships, because if they're at all sophisticated, they do manage to a large extent to control cyberspace as well as other.
There's a lot of hashtags that go around. So whether it's like, oh, you know, like, speak up, or just like, no, don't be afraid. Just like these small hashtags that kind of develop into bigger hashtags, like Black Lives Matter, or like, you know, like Asian Life Matters. Like, there's so many different races that all matter, or like the Me Too movement, or like just standing up for what you believe in and not being afraid to say what's on your mind.
Yeah.
So I feel like social media helps with that, because without it, you couldn't really get your voice out and say it. Like,
another thing is like social media. I think people just do it just to post about it. I don't think they actually go to protest because they want to go protest.
Yeah.
Like, if you take away the phones and all the other platforms, I don't think people would legit go out and go protest.
It's just to take a selfie at the protest.
Just to show people that they care for that. Because again, it comes down to like likes and comments and share.
So, in terms of social media and activism, social media has made activism digestible. It has made it easy to find out about. Oh my God, there's a protest in my neighborhood, I'm gonna go to that. Oh my God, it's an event. It's made it like a party. It's made it like everybody can participate, but keeping in mind that activism is a full-time job. You have to plan, organize, contact people, you need a team, you need to be out there, regardless of weather, making signs, making your voices heard, and establishing a movement. So social media has now made it so the average Joe can get in on something that is actually extreme. Protesting is as American as apple pie, but now it's social media. It's created this voyeuristic perspective for people to kind of dip their toes in. Like, oh, I was there, I took a picture. I mean, you're there, but you're not there. You can even live stream now. So if you can't be there, you can watch and just send a love or a like or an angry face, a smiley face, a crying face. Everyone gets to react and have their opinion, but it may not mean anything at all unless you're actually, for lack of a better term, pulling your bootstraps up and getting involved and actually making a difference.
I heard this saying that you should always be open to hear what people have to say, and just because you're hearing what they're saying, it doesn't mean that you have to take everything that they said. You only take the good things from what you heard. So I might not be open to what they're saying, and it doesn't have to be about, like, you know, politically. It can be in general. Like, I feel like we should be open to hear what other people say, even though it is going to upset us. And if there is anything that is positive in it, we should at least take those things, and whatever upsetted us, just leave that behind. At least you heard them, and you're taking the good from it. Whatever good there was in that thought, you take it for yourself. And if it's like really, really hateful, I don't think you should, like, if it's like a slur, like a negative slur, I don't think you should ever engage with that type of person because it's only going to provoke you to say something negative like that. Like, and just saying negative things to each other and negative slurs, it's not going to fix anything. You're just going to, it's just going to make the fire bigger.
What is the best way for people from different backgrounds and with different opinions to communicate? Should people be encouraged to engage in conversations with people who have opinions that upset them? What if these opinions are hateful? How does one address people that have these opinions, especially if a large number of people hold them? Which, you kind of talked about with the Trump.
Screw them.
Yeah.
Don't engage. Screw them. Move on.
Right.
That's my opinion.
That's your opinion.
It's like, no.
Yeah.
I'll work on the young ones. They're not fully formed yet. We can save them.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, the ones who are too entrenched are too entrenched.
Right.
You know what I mean?
You feel like it won't do anything trying to have conversations?
I mean, you can kind of lead through example of just entrenchment. How can you be?
Yeah.
So sometimes I think the best way to do it is to kind of be a model. You know what I mean? Just kind of show how tolerance and discussion can be productive. And so I guess I sort of feel like my work in that area is done through teaching.
Right, yeah.
More than anything else, or just being a kind human being. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of, and then you're like, well, maybe if they realize that people who believe what I believe can be kind or understanding or you know what I mean, or that kind of stuff, it can help soften positions.
So you feel like it's doing the work on yourself, kind of, instead of like to show the example as opposed to reaching out to try to change people's opinions.
Well, I mean, as a teacher,
oh yeah, it was.
I guess for me, it's a lot of, like I co-sponsor the GSA club at our school. You know what I mean? Work with the students who, it's a Gender and Sexuality Alliance club, and you know what I mean, and just kind of. And promote that and just be like, and when we talk about it, I'm like, it's all cool, guys. Like, people should just, you know what I mean, be able to be there with their people. Like, why is that hurting you? You know what I mean? So I just kind of try to kind of make them realize that, you don't have to be reactionary. You can just accept people and just kind of have that viewpoint, like sort of diffuse it in some ways by sort of showing your own acceptingness of it and why it's not distressing to you. You know what I mean? And like right now in class we're getting ready to have debates, and so that idea of sort of being able to talk about things and think about other sides and all that kind of thing. But in the real world, the world outside of teaching, I think I just more like try to model it for my kids than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. First of all, I think one should not immediately conclude that opinions that you don't share are necessarily hurtful or hateful. It's good to be exposed to opinions you don't share. Now, there are, of course, hateful opinions or offensive opinions, and they are part of life. You don't seek them out. If you come across them, you might try and argue against them. Sometimes, if they're truly hateful, they tend not to be subject to reason, and so arguing with an unreasoned prejudice is usually a waste of time. But I think there is too much tendency to feel that opinions that one finds socially inappropriate or reactionary or something like that are necessarily hurtful. I don't think one needs to be hurt by contrary opinions. I think that bar should be higher than it often is, and it's good to be exposed to things that make you feel uncomfortable, in the sense that it pushes you to think further than you're normally inclined to do. I mean, sticking to your comfort zone is not usually the way to learn about something new or interesting or contrary to what you always thought. So it's very good to push yourself intellectually, and that means exposing yourself to things that you might not immediately find cozy.
Okay. So then when it comes to being hurt by other people's opinions, generally speaking, I think that there's a minority who's hurt by a majority opinion. Generally, at least right now, and I could use the example of being a trans individual. I think that trans individuals are completely ostracized by the majority of society, or feel ostracized by the majority of society. And I think that when you are oppressed or experience prejudice in such a specific way from such a majority of people, you have a complete right to ignore that and to not engage with it. I think, though, that it's probably helpful if there are some people who are educating. And I think that the problem is that a lot of times people take I don't have a right to engage with this to I have a right to berate other people and to turn this into a massive argument. And I think that when arguments like that break out, you end up with people who don't actually change anything. And I don't think it's anybody's right. It's anybody's obligation to educate someone else. So, like, you know, it's not the job of a gay man to try to convince a straight homophobic man that being gay is okay. But I think it would be helpful if more people would be in positions where they're faced with someone who has a hurtful opinion, and that they're willing to sort of talk with them and maybe change their mind, because that is how change happens, not by yelling at each other.
I absolutely believe that people with differing opinions should have conversation. I can think of examples of people who are involved in Black Lives Matter having conversation with white Aryan nation people, and actually changing their position. I think face-to-face conversation allows for a humanizing of people. I think eating food together, really, break bread. Sit down and eat food with somebody, cook with somebody, learn something about it, work on a project together, get outside of who you are. If social media could be used to connect people on local levels in real life situations, that would be great.
Is forgetting the background. Don't just look for people that, once again, you identify with, because then you're just reinforcing your points. You know, once again, look to broaden your horizon, your paradigm, and talk to people of different walks of life. You know, we always talk about it, you know, you don't know somebody until you walk, you know, whatever, a day in their shoes. Try to do that, and social media should make that, you know, even easier for you. You know, they said the 1920s was the, you know, the dawn of, you know, the age of information. Well, no, this is the dawn of information. This is the age of information. It's so quick. So, you know, be vigilant, but also try to have that casual approach too. I mean, you're going to talk to somebody. Don't just like, okay, this person's different from me. You know, we say this all the time with, like, you know, people we want to vote for. Well, they're gay, you know, that they're a war veteran, they're this and they're that. So we put all these labels, and it's like, okay, well, just because they're not similar to you and they're not, you know, the same walk of life, you know, doesn't mean they're all too different. You know, we're all human beings here. I think, once again, this comes back to how we're raised, and the social media, it just amplifies these preconceived biases that are really drilled into our heads at a young age. So, yeah, just people as you would normally anyone. I mean, if you're a aggressive or violent person, that's how you're going to be. But if you're someone, I guess, like me, who's really chill, I don't care what creed, race, color you are. I'll dress you as you are, and we can all. I want to say this strongly. We can all have our immediate, you know, instantaneous biases when we see somebody. We're like, oh wait, what are you? Okay, because you can't control that. That's, you know, that's innate. That's innate. So I wouldn't say we should not police that. We should let that live. But how you communicate, how you address people, that's something that you can control. So, yeah.
I guess it was also the idea of if people are hateful is you try to, I guess if you sense something is maybe dangerously hateful, then you take a different approach.
Oh, like addressing it on social media or just in general?
I guess she's talking about social media here, or I don't know actually.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we had in the Bronx, I think this was just last year, 2017 or 2018, that was my one. I think when we had a white supremacist who was going to work in a Bronx hospital, I think it was last year or the year before, you need to address that. Yeah, and it was addressed. People made a big stink about it, and that's what they have to do. All that being said, if somebody, let's say, of a different religion is just coming into your neighborhood, welcome them. Give people the opportunity. But if they're coming off already and letting you know their agenda, even if it's, like, I'll say Nazis have the right to protest. White supremacists have the right to protest. However, if they begin to incite violence and commit violent acts, they come under the weight of the law.
Right.
So we can't get to a point where we're trying to act like as if we're omnipotent beings. No, we're human beings. So let people speak. I think that's the biggest thing. Once again, have the conversation, but don't get to a point where you're already cutting people off or not letting people speak. Actions do speak louder than words, but the words actually lead to the action. So have that conversation and try to find a way to seek preventative means, but not those type of preventative means that dissuade people or deter people from actually talking to you. Because it even comes back, I want to tie this in even with school shootings. If we had more counselors in schools than cops, school shootings would go down. Yeah, you take away the guns, but every school shooting, I believe, there are multiple people that know about it in advance, but they're too scared to tell an adult. So that tells us two things: trust and, accessibility.
So, being Muslim, I get a lot of hate comments and like how I just whether it's like terrorist shows or if I don't cover my body enough or if like even small things as if like my ankle is showing or if my arm is showing too much, there's so many people critiquing everything.
Yeah.
So I choose to ignore them because one, they don't even understand the religion enough to critique on it, and two, they don't understand me enough to critique on what I'm doing and what that is. So, but I mean, it's also like, there's other people that also relate to that because there's so many other Muslims that would go out with like, short sleeves or just like really tight pants, but they'd wear the hijab, and it's like, some people would perceive it as it's okay, at least she has a hijab on, and other people would be like, oh my god, how can she wear the hijab and then wear tight pants?
Yeah.
So, it's just, you have to not care about what other people say.
I think the best way
they don't understand
is basically talking to a person, because when you go to the internet, you find many things that you're not sure if it's 100% true, bias or whatever it is. A good example would be like, for example, like what's happening with the Muslim society. Like a lot of people think that Muslims are terrorists, but if you actually go hang out with a Muslim person and you see the way your perception is like completely changed versus when you see something on social media and you're like, okay, this is the way, there's nothing else.
For example, I know we were talking about the N-word before.
Yeah.
So, the N-word historically is very, like if you're not a person of color or a black an African person, African American, you're not allowed to say that word because they are allowed to say that word between each other. But there's even some people who are people of color that say no, like we shouldn't be using that word even if it's between us, like between
Yeah.
two African American people. But I know they now people use it just like, you know, to say like, you know, what's up, like, you know, homie,
Yeah.
or like, you know, brother, or good,
Yeah.
like, you know, that's
Yeah.
how people use the word. And I feel like if another race uses it in that context, I wouldn't be annoyed by it. But at the same time, I am not a person of, you know, I'm not an African American person, so I cannot, you know, justify that and be like, yeah, you can use it because it's not my history.
Yeah.
Per se, but if a person is using it in a negative context, like, you know, that it's like you know, racism, I wouldn't accept it. Like, you know, I don't think it's it's right.
Yeah. Just to, like, kind of give another example, at my college there was, like, there was a lot of backlash because a, like, professor giving a there was a play that was written about racism, and the N-word was used in it because it was, like, showing slave owners, and it wasn't, like, a pro-slavery play, it was showing the time period. And then, so he was giving this presentation, and he used the N-word while he was having the lecture, and he was, like, a white guy, and there was, like, a huge amount of, like, backlash and protest against it. Like, what do you think about a situation like that?
I mean, if he was trying to get, like, a point across, like, it was a lesson, and you say it wasn't pro-slavery, it was just to, like, get something out, I don't necessarily agree with it. Because he wasn't, you know, like you say, it wasn't pro-slavery, he wasn't trying to spread hate, he was trying to explain something. And then in some situations, you have to use the word, a particular word to explain, to, like, you know, that way that person can understand it. But I don't know, I'm not, you know, I'm not, I can, you know, I'm not part of that race group, so I can't really be in their shoes to understand why they're against, like, I understand why they're against it because, you know, there's a lot of historical, you know, sadness behind that word, you know, they went through a lot,
Right.
and that word was used to demeanor them or, you know, make them feel less. So I understand why they, you know, they don't want anyone else to say it. I guess at the same time, I guess they wouldn't want a person that historically oppressed them used it. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because the professor was a white man, and for him to use it, a white man to use it, I understand why. I also understand why they would be offended, but at the same time, I don't think they're not seeing the bigger picture.
What your thoughts are about
well,
it?
also, I was thinking about the B word, too.
Yeah, I was thinking since, like, because with the N-word, you know, like, you can't really relate to it, but I was thinking if there's, like, any word that you can...
But the B word I can
or, like,
relate
like
to.
slut, or, like, some word like that is, I don't know.
The B word, like, I understand, like, for example, the B word I can relate to because I am a woman.
Yeah.
And if I hear a man use it against me, I would find it very demeaning. Because historically, men are viewed, more, you know, superior than women. So if a man were to use it, I would feel very offended. But if a woman were to use it, even if she was using it in a negative context, for some reason, I don't find it as demeaning as if it were a man to say it. I don't really know why, but I, like, if a woman were to say the B word to me, I would get upset, but not as upset as a man would.
So you feel like the history kind of determines
the
context, or like...
Yeah, so it does.
Yeah.
I do agree with that. The history does determine the context.
I think I know it a little bit. I mean, what pops to my mind, I don't know if this is exactly what you feel, but, you know, my oldest is 15, you know, and, you know, we're very, you know, a liberal family that, you know what I mean, sort of is pushing back against, you know, I mean, in our minds, you know, sort of patriarchy and, you know, white supremacy and all that kind of stuff. And we talk about it a lot in politics, and we talk a lot about, I mean, and Loki's best friend is biracial lesbian, you know what I mean, and his other best friend is going through some gender things, and she isn't sure where she is in terms of the spectrum of gender and all that kind of stuff, and is in a lesbian relationship right now. So, and they just started a Young Democrats club at our high school, at his high school, and it's interesting because even though we talk about all this kind of stuff, I mean, not even though, because we talk about all this stuff, and I think he's been raised to be so aware of it and kind of aware of those ways that racism and sexism and all that kind of stuff kind of manifest themselves in subtle ways in a society, because that's always been something we've talked about. I think sometimes the weight of being a white male is kind of hard on him. You know what I mean? Like, I think he feels like, am I still allowed?
Right.
You know what I mean? And is my struggle important too? You know what I mean? Which is a real struggle, I do think. I think being a white male, you know what I mean?
Like the associations with that?
Yes, exactly, are really hard, particularly when you're this sensitive, open-minded, you know what I mean, kind of thoughtful person. So how do you, you know, I mean, so that power and that how you know, that sort of male combativeness and kind of the way that boys are raised to be with each other can be really hard, I think, on young men. And he's always sort of had, you know, struggles with that in terms of feeling, I think, battered by that at times, even though he negotiates it very well in some ways. Like, if you met him, you wouldn't necessarily think that, but I think it has been a struggle for him. So to me, it's like, I'm like, yes, you know, we do have this weight of all these things. I'm like, but that does not mean you can't be the president. You know what I mean? Because it came up with his Young Democrats Club, because in a way he has been raised out of his, they formed it together, he and his three friends, in the most politically aware political family.
Right.
So in a way, he's like, I kind of want to be the president. And I was like, well, you kind of should be the president, because you actually probably know a lot. You know, I mean, your friends are wonderful people, but they're just not, they just haven't been raised to be as aware. And they ended up compromising and doing just like board members, you know what I mean? Like, they all became, which I thought was great and fine and a perfect solution. But I think sometimes, you know what I mean, that weight, you know what I mean? I mean, I think that everybody feels, you know what I mean, from the history of being female and kind of all the weight that goes with that, and being a cisgendered female and being, you know, whatever, you know what I mean? Like, we all have that sort of political weight and this wokeness that's, people are thinking about all sorts of identity things. But there's also just, like, being you. You know what I mean? There's also just, like, you being able to be authentically you. And if you're a leader like he is, and you have a lot of opinions and you want to organize people, then why shouldn't he do it just because he's a white guy with blue eyes and blonde hair? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, I'm like, that shouldn't stop you. Just like it shouldn't stop your friend who, you know, maybe trans or whatever, you know what I mean? You know, so it's tricky though, because I do think we're in our day and age now, it's people think so much about that stuff, which is great. But then
hard
there's
to not see everything through the lens.
Yeah, exactly. And even then, you know, like, I mean, his friend right now who's going through all the gender stuff, like, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for it. We've had friends who are transgender, but I'm also like, you know, but ultimately she can just be Ellie. I mean, she can just be herself. Or they selves. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, in a way, those labels sometimes can get overly complicated, I feel like. So it's like, there's power in those, pushing at those labels and getting away. But then I think also, when I've known people who've gotten older, those labels become less important. You know what I mean? Like, the man, female, it just becomes, you become a little bit, hopefully the growth is you just become you.
Right,
You know what I mean? Like, because I had a friend who went through transition later. And then I do worry sometimes about it being, when people are so young and they feel like they've got to figure themselves out.
Right, they have to be a defined thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know, Like, you give yourself till you're 40.
Right.
Even then, you might not have figured it the hell out
Right,
yet.
yeah.
So I don't know if that ties into Facebook or not, but.
That's really interesting because the most recent Facebook back and forth is from my more religious, right-leaning things. Came a story from California schools that there are California schools that are pushing for inclusivity of LGBTQ practices, and the legislation that was just passed wants the introduction of that aspect of people's lives to be put in the history textbooks at a very young age. And there are people who don't really think that it matters whether or not Sally Ride was a lesbian, and don't really think a first grader needs to know that, or a second grader. So there's this fight about what should be included and at what age. So I asked my very liberal progressive friends to weigh in on this, and so one of mine obliged, and she, in doing so, talked about some of the deviant sexual practices of our founding fathers, and how when she learned about it, it made it easier for her to understand the atrocities they committed against the native peoples. So I wrote back to her and I said, so you use this phrase deviant practices, you know, so what is that, and who gets to decide? And what do we do with things like North American Man-Boy Love Association, whose motto is sex before 8 or it's too late, who lobby Congress to remove all consent age laws? What do we do with the people who are lobbying for incest to be allowed, for a mother to be able to marry her own son, for instance? Yes, it's a real case. What about bestiality? People think it doesn't exist, but, you know, it shows up in the front page of the Kingston Freeman that some guy molested a man in Ellenville's horse.
It's actually legal in Germany.
It's illegal most places. It's illegal here. So the question then becomes, well, who gets to decide what's legal and what's illegal? And then once something that was once illegal is now legal and normalized, do we go back and rewrite all of history to point out that this person engaged in this particular practice? So for me, I was thrilled with Sally Ride. And I was telling my husband, I never thought of astronauts as being sexual. I think of them as being astronauts. Like, really, you're kind of busy being an astronaut. Having a sex life just didn't even occur to me when you're an astronaut. I don't care what her practices were or are. Does it matter that she was a woman? Yes, because she broke a barrier where people were excluded. If you could prove that the real reason that she was excluded from certain things was because of her sexual practices, then yes, it might be an important thing to include in a history book. I don't know of any history book that says Thomas Jefferson, who was heterosexual, or, you know, like, why do we need to know?
Right.
So I really think history is not truth. There is no true history book out there. Well, I would say if you read the history accounts in the Bible, that's true. But history is written from the perspective of the historian, and those perspectives shift over time, and history narratives shift over time. Columbus used to be celebrated, now he's derided. He'll probably be celebrated again when they dig up some other information that they didn't have before. History is a very interesting subject, and I think we're better served if we can name the major figures and describe as best as possible the social dynamics of the culture that they were living in, and let those pieces speak for themselves, because every historian interprets from the history they read and creates their own.
Obviously, if you were to like really follow that, it would now, white people would be slaves to black people for like 50 to 100 years, and then we would get let out and have trouble,
Like,
not
what
be
would-
able to vote. Like, I don't know that it's clear, obviously like an extreme example, but I think if you do it that, I was gonna say something a little bit more intelligent. I don't know. I mean, I think at every single point in history, every group has suffered at the hands of some other group. Like that's just sort of the way things go. I think in recent history, like white Eastern European people, not just Eastern, but all of Europe in general, sort of, they were the first to like develop like guns and like more high-tech military equipment. And in a more savage time like that, it made sense to just go and take. I mean, the way you got land in the 1500s was you went over to your neighbor and you guys slapped each other until one of you was like, okay, you can have the land.
Yeah.
So that's just sort of the way it was, and I think because times have changed, it's just like it's different sort of in the way like conquest works. Like it seems to me that like the most recent and sort of intense conquest. I mean, this is like conspiracy theory, but I'm pretty sure Putin just like put Trump like in office pretty much, and Trump has just been sort of working for him remotely.
There's no question that inequality exists, that there are historical reasons for it, that it can continue for structural reasons, like access to education and so on and so forth. There's no doubt about that. So the question is really, how do you deal with that best? I have two areas of skepticism. One is, I think, if too much attention is paid to specific words that cannot be used, in other words, the language and so on, it can become a substitute for more substantive political action. In other words, it's easy for white liberals to feel that as long as they stick to the right language codes and hand out prizes to worthy people of colour and so on, that they've sort of done their job and it means they're fine people and that's it. Whereas there is real political work to be done to redress inequalities, and I think we should concentrate on the here and now and really look at ways in which all people have better access to education, have better chances, that job discrimination disappears, and so on. And I think too much talk, again, one should know the history and why these inequalities exist, but I think too much concentration on the past can stand in the way a little bit of doing something about it in the present. So I'm much more in favour of promoting policies that can, in the end, one hopes, eradicate inequality through social change, political change, and so on, than I am in too much talk about 19th century history, whether we should compensate people for what happened then, and so on. I'm not necessarily against compensation for the history of slavery or anything like that, but I'm not persuaded that we should make that into the main focus of our attention. I think we should do much more to think about harder questions, like what do we do to make people's lives better right now.
Just to the second part of the question about how do you allow people to still exist with individuality and specificity, I think just because we were talking about this in class, it was interesting, like how how you kind of stop a vicious cycle of anger kind of happening, just because, for example, at Bard, I know there's kind of a lot of like a lot of jokes about like white men being terrible, and that kind of causes resentment. And then I wonder, like, how do you address that history of?
Well, I think by being very aware that everybody is an individual, whatever the color of your skin or your background, and should be able to express themselves as individuals too, and not as representatives of an ethnicity or a class. I mean, we're also all part of something, usually part of more than one thing. I mean, most of us are mixed in one way or another. So I'm quite skeptical about, for example, treating artists or writers as representatives or representative voices of a race or a religion or a culture. That is certainly part of their makeup and usually part of their work. But in the end, their work should be evaluated according to its quality, its merits, and whether it tells us something about the truth. And so, and that doesn't necessarily depend on what your background is. That depends on who you are, and as an individual. And so, I think all generalizations about race and religion and so on are to be avoided, or simply dismissing people because they belong to one group or another. I think that's a big mistake. In the end, we while being aware of who we are and who other people are, and there are obviously ways in which we identify with larger communities, but in the end, we have to treat one another as individuals.